what a fish that is.
Today we're going to talk big perch fishing. Now we will cover a few techniques and things like that towards the end of the video, but before then I want to cover a couple of topics that are really important if you are going to go out and try to catch a fish of, let's say, your first 3 pounder, 4 pounder. The size of the fish is absolutely irrelevant really, because the rules are all the same. Venue choice is absolutely vital when you're trying to catch a big fish. So like I say, whether you're trying to catch a 2, a 3, a 4 or a 5, the same things have to be taken into consideration. Now you can split this into 2 categories. You've got anglers that are able to travel and are willing to travel, and anglers that either can't or just want to stay fishing their locals, things like that. So if you are willing to travel, then it really is the sky's the limit. Let's say you want to catch your first 4 pounder, or you're trying to break that PB. Pick a venue that have got verified captures of fish of the stamp that you're trying to catch. Now that sounds really obvious, but it is so vital that you do that. If you're on a venue that has never done a 4 pounder, trying to catch a 4 pounder out of that venue might not be impossible, but it's going to be much more difficult than going to a venue that has got a history of producing fish of that stamp. So venue choice is vital. Now if you are travelling and you are going onto a venue that you've never seen before, you've never been on before, don't worry about location. It's important that you're on a venue capable of producing that calibre of fish. You can work everything out later on your own. If you have got friends or people that are willing to give you some pointers on these venues, then by all means take their advice on board. You can't beat people that have advice from people that have already been on those venues. But if people are not willing to point you in the right direction, don't worry about that, because us as anglers, at the end of the day, it is down to us to work a venue out. And through personal experience, I find working a venue out yourself is much more rewarding when it all comes good. You find the fish that you want to catch and you've done it all off your own hard work. So yeah, the only thing you need to concern yourself with is picking a venue with the calibre of fish that you're trying to catch. Now on the flip side of that, if you are fishing your local venues and you haven't got the means, or you can't get out further, you don't have the time to do that, let's say again you want to catch a 4 pounder but the venues local to you have just never produced fish of that size, then don't worry about that. It doesn't make you a lesser angler that you're fishing for smaller fish. Do some research into your venues, look at what verified captures have come out of there, and I always emphasise on the fact verified captures, because you want to make sure that they are genuinely fish of that size in that venue. So let's say you want to catch a 4, but you've got a canal that the biggest fish it's ever done is a 3 pounder and it occasionally does the odd 2. Now if you're catching 40 centimetre fish, 2 pound plus fish on a semi-regular basis, then you're doing exceptionally well. So it's all about having a real in-depth knowledge of your local venues in regards to what it has produced, and then just set your targets realistic to that venue. As much as we all want to go out and catch these massive, like big 40 plus centimetre fish, your 4s and all that, if your venue doesn't have them, then just, so let's say lower expectations, but just basically just make your targets realistic. Don't set yourself up to fail before you've even cast a lure into the water. So yeah, having in-depth knowledge of venues, whether you're travelling or whether you're on locals, really is important. What I would always tend to do is, if I'm fishing a venue that's, let's say again, just for argument's sake, the biggest fish it's done is 3 pounds, automatically my target is to catch something bigger than 3 pound, even if it's 3 pound 1. So that's how I would look at it. If you are on local venues, find out what it's produced, how long ago was that, are there still fish of that calibre coming out in recent years, or even, even better if there's some that's already come out this season, and then just try to target fish of that size. Don't worry about catching your 4s and things like that, because hopefully that will come in the future when you can get on venues that have got fish of that calibre in them. Now another really important thing to consider is what sources do you listen to. I say not listen to, but what sources do you follow? Now, if you are a specimen angler, and it doesn't matter whether you're a lure angler for perch or something else, at some point or another, we've all chased rumours. Sometimes they'll pay off, more often than not they won't. Now, as an example, I was fishing a few years ago down one of the drains, got down to a venue, there was a bridge there, and there was a pod of fish, maybe, from what I could see, probably 7 or 8 strong, all like 40 plus centimetre fish in that sort of 2 to 3 pound bracket. No monsters in there, but respectable sized fish. Caught a few of them. They sort of backed off, couldn't go the other side of the bridge because the bank was so built up. And then I think I ended up having one more sort of just grinding away with a drop shot, I think it was. So we caught a few of those fish, ended up moving on. On the way back, we bumped into a dog walker, and I think he'd seen exactly the same pod of fish that I'd seen, because when we got there was bait fish being smashed up against this bridge wall again, and I think he had seen those, exactly the same group of fish that I'd seen. And he's telling me that he saw on his pod of fish, they must be 4 or 5 pound, they're all massive. Now, he's not lying, and I don't even think he's exaggerating. I think all it is he's got no perspective. He's probably not seen a 3 pounder before, so all of a sudden these fish have just been inflated to fish that they're just not. So this is where I'm saying about being careful. I don't think it's always malicious. I don't think it's always people lying and exaggerating. I do think in a lot of the cases fish are just seen by, good fish are seen by anglers with nothing to compare them to, or like say dog walkers that may have done a bit of fishing, things like that. So if you do hear a story about a real big, and just see if you can do a little bit of digging into that venue, see if you can find any other sources of big fish being caught from there. The last thing you want to do is go all in on a venue you don't know for a fish that potentially might not even be there. You might be going all in for a 4 pounder that actually turns out to be a 2.5. So just be very careful with the information that you end up following, because like I say, I've been led up the garden path a few times, and like I say, I don't think it was a malicious thing. I do think it's just people don't necessarily have the perspective of what a 4 pound plus fish looks like in the water. So that is, again, something else that is very important to take into consideration. Now, moving on to the techniques, one thing to start all this out with is that everything works when it comes to catching perch. You can talk to anglers, I know anglers that their favourite way of catching big perch is by dragging a big creature bait along on a cheb rig. They've caught loads of big fish, or on the flip side of that, I know other anglers that will fish like sub 1 gram jig heads or cheb weights on micro lures, and they have caught no end of big perch as well. So it is worth pointing out that there isn't anything that doesn't work in regards to lure fishing for perch. What I would advise is try everything. Don't become an angler that's sort of pigeonholed into fishing 1 or 2 things all the time. Even though they're effective and they might have caught you hundreds of fish over the years, being more versatile is definitely going to work in your favour in the long run, by being able to fish in weedy venues, rocky venues, in real crap windy conditions, flat, calm, bright, hot days with no cloud cover. By trying everything, you're going to be able to build up a picture over a period of time of what works in what conditions. So it's definitely something that's worth taking into consideration. Let's say if your favourite and your go-to is a 2 gram jig head with a gunky rockstar on, that is brilliant for catching fish, but there are times where there are better options than that. So it is a case of, and it's not even so much lures, it's more techniques. You can do a lot more with using different techniques than having a box full of different lures. Now what I mean by that is, if you've got 3 lures in your box, 3 different styles of lures, let's take the gunky kiddie for example. I use that as an example, not for the lure itself, but that style of lure, like little fork tails, fluke style baits. You can get that one lure to probably fish 10 different ways for you if you've got the components to tie up different rigs. So I can use that as a top water, I can use it as a soft plastic jerk bait, I can fish it on a Carolina, I can on a jig head and hop it along the bottom, drop shot. Techniques are more important than or rigs are more important than the actual lure itself, because you can make these lures do some incredible things if you've got the right components to tie up all these different techniques. So if you're going to go into a tackle shop and buy loads of stuff, I would buy I would prioritise buying all the components to tie up different techniques, different rigs, than I would go out and spend hundreds of pounds on different lures. Get all the components first, and then add your lures after that, if that makes sense. Because like I say, I can do a lot more with 3 different lures, but being able to tie up 10 different rigs, than I can do being able to tie up 3 different rigs and have 100 lures. So that is definitely something that I would always advise. Have the bits there to tie up all these different things. It's just my opinion, but I do think that that's put extra fish on the bank for me over the years. Now, getting into the rigs that have put probably the most big fish on the bank for me over the years. I'm not going to get into everything, because the video will end up being like a day long. But looking at just the things that have constantly produced for me over the years, and the ones that are like my sort of go-to staple techniques that I do use. Now, the first one would be, I've caught some nice fish on top water baits. I've caught some really big fish on top water baits in previous seasons, but there are other techniques that I think have caught more fish for me at a certain size throughout the summer, and that would be hard baits. Now, whether you're a fan of crankbaits, jerk baits, hard baits do seem to have a knack of producing bigger fish, and I think the reason for that is I don't know how many people have noticed this. I've certainly noticed it in my personal fishing. When you're using, I'm more of a fan of a crankbait than a jerk bait throughout the summer, but when I am using a crankbait, the biggest fish that I tend to catch in when I get to a new spot tends to be, if I'm going to catch the first or second fish, I tend to catch the bigger fish quickly, and then if I'm catching after that, it tends to be smaller fish. Not saying the fish are small, but the bigger ones always seem to come sooner. And I think the reason is, whether you're burning a crankbait through a pod of fish or you're using a jerk bait above them, why I think it produces the better quality fish is when you've seen, if you ever fish clear water and you've been lucky enough to see a pod of perch, let's say you've seen a pod of 40 centimetre fish, a majority of the fish in there might be 40 to 43 centimetre, but there'll always be 1 or 2 that are just slightly bigger than the rest. They might be 45s or even 46 centimetre. And I think the reason why these hard baits do seem to be able to pick those bigger fish out of the pod is those fish have got bigger because they eat. They're a bit more aggressive, they eat a lot more, hence why they've got bigger than the rest of the pod. And I think your crankbaits, either like say burning a crankbait through the middle of them or a jerkbait over the top, I think you're just tapping into that sort of that aggressive, I want that before the rest of them get it kind of mood that these bigger fish do have. And I think that is why these hard baits do tend to pick out the bigger fish quite quickly. I'm not saying you're going to go down to the river and catch a 45 centimetre fish straight away, but when you are moving to different spots and you do end up dropping on a pod of bigger fish, it always seems to be the bigger fish that you catch in that spot will fall almost immediately to these hard baits. And I do think that is probably what it is. You're just sort of keying into that aggressive instinct that these bigger fish have got. And like I say, they haven't got big through not eating. They eat a lot, hence why they are bigger than the rest of the fish that they're with. It's just like my theory into it, but there is a reason why hard baits do seem to produce bigger fish more frequently than say soft plastics do, in my opinion, and like based on my own fishing. And I think there's several other anglers as well that I've spoken to that do catch a bigger average on hard baits than they do on soft plastics, and I'm convinced that that's what it is. You're just tapping into that aggression that these bigger fish have got. Now, sort of sticking with crankbaits, even when they're not on cranks, they can really stir the fish up. They can put them on alert. Now, that might not sound like a good thing, but again, going into a session I had a few weeks ago with one of my mates, we get to a spot, whack a crankbait out, 2 casts, nothing. Again, if you are on a crankbait or hard baits, you do tend to catch the fish quickly. If you've not had a fish in a spot even as quickly as that, within 2 or 3 casts, I will cast down the same line multiple times, but then I will always follow it up with something else, something slower, more methodical. So I had 2 casts down the same line, nothing. 1 cast up there with a Ned rig, and bang, with 47 plus centimetre perch. And I think sometimes just stirring the fish up, getting them a little, if they are all on the bottom lethargic, waking them up a little bit, and then something as inert and sort of unthreatening as what a Ned rig can be, can work really well. Now, sticking on the theme of the Ned rig, Another session I had probably maybe 6-8 weeks ago now. We get down to a spot, and this is just how effective that this rig can be. And I think sometimes it's the way that they're fished as well, and what I think the Ned rig is representing. We get to a spot, I have one cast up with a Ned rig, and bang, we're into a 40 centimetre fish straight away. You know, really pleased with it, because even though it's not a monster, this was finished work. We had a few hours before I had to go and do the school run, so any fish of 40 centimetres and above is a result. So get that fish in the net, resting him, next cast up there, bang, 42 centimetre fish. So I then go deal with these fish, you know, do a little bit for camera, release them, come back to the spot, cast in again, and all I'm doing is, again, I've mentioned this 100 times, is shaking that slack in the line. I think the slower the technique, the harder it is for sometimes people to get the grips with it. I think sometimes when you're dead sticking and you're just literally fishing static with like on a Ned rig, because the lure's floating, it's always going to have an element of movement to it. I think some people just think that they're almost like they're not fishing, they're not working the lure, they're not going to get a bite, which is the complete opposite to how the Ned rig is most effective. And I think that's why some people struggle with it. So on this particular day, one of my favourite ways of picking an area apart on the Ned rig, and again I've mentioned it no end of times, loads of slack line, constantly shaking the rod quite aggressively. And I think this is going to be an easier way for people that are struggling with a Ned rig to actually fish it, because it still feels like you're doing a lot. And I will fish this quite aggressive, I will shake that rod tip really hard, but because of the element of slack that I've got in my line, all I'm doing is moving that lure from here to here. But what it is doing when I am shaking that, it's constantly making this lure just quiver on the bottom like that. Now when we got to this spot, we've had the 240s out of here, release them, and occasionally you would see a perch smashing bait fish in the area. And what I have seen in previous seasons and things like that, I have seen big perch smashing bait fish up against walls and structure, whether it even weed beds. You'll see them coming up and they'll nail a load, and then inevitably you will see the odd bait fish either stunned and dying or dead, and it will float to the top, and you'll see like it's missing scales where the perch have actually had it. I think what that Ned is representing is a stunned or dying bait fish on the bottom, which is why it works so effectively in areas like this where there's loads of commotion, there's fish hitting bait fish everywhere, and you've got these big lazy perch that sat below all the commotion, and there's your little stick bait or creature bait, whatever Ned bait you're using, and all it's doing is that on the bottom. It's resembling something that's dying, and these big fish are just hoovering it up. So when we release these two fish, we cast up, and bang, we're into I think like a big 40 centimetre perch. So you know, absolutely buzzing then at this point. Do a little bit for camera with that fish, release it. Just before we have to go and I do the school run, I have one more cast, and bang, you know, another mid 40 centimetre fish, all on the same lure, fished exactly the same way on the same rig. So if you are picking a small area apart, fishing the Ned rig in that manner, I do not think there is a better lure or better technique for picking a area apart than that. It can be an issue if you're fishing in thick weed, things like that. That's when, again, like I've mentioned before, we have to fish the situation, not just what we want to fish, because sometimes what we want to fish is just not effective. But if you do find an area that has got patches in the weed, doesn't have weed at all, even better, that way of fishing it, just constantly shaking that slack line so that lure is really slowly moving to the point you might take as long as 5 minutes on one cast. Might sound ridiculous, but it has caught so many big fish for me over the years, and I would say probably over half of the 40 plus centimetre fish I've had this year has been on that as well. It's an incredible way of fishing the Ned rig, and it works so very well. Now moving on from that, again, I don't apologise for bringing it up again, because I've spoke about it a lot, I'll continue to speak about it a lot, is a chatterbait. In my opinion, the gunky boomer, in the price point it is, the 5 gram one. Cut the skirt in half, put the peps on upside down. The peps boomer combination is an amazing combo for fishing in weedy conditions, or if you've got loads of snags, things like that. It performs really well. It outfishes the crank in them situations purely because it's fishing effectively for longer. Your crankbaits are getting fouled up with weed too often. If you're on a venue like that, try a chatterbait. They do catch some really big fish throughout probably summer to mid-autumn. that combination over the years has probably, I would say between that and the Ned rig, has put the most amount of big fish on the bank for me. Great fun to fish as well, brilliant fun to fish, very easy to fish as well. There are multiple ways to fish it, but you can just cast it out, sink to the bottom, and then just slowly wind it in. It's as simple as that. But they have a knack for catching some really big perch and chatterbaits. And just because I talk about the boomer, if you're not a fan of them, chatterbaits in general, but if you've not tried the boomer, I can't talk that lure up enough. The gunky boomer with the gunky perch trailer, it is absolutely amazing. And I've got several mates as well that have been using it, and they've had some big fish on it as well. So really, really effective when you are targeting those bigger fish in warmer water. They do work in the winter, but they're nowhere near as effective as what they are throughout the warmer months. Now moving on from that, the drop shot is what I'll probably finish on. Again, I can talk about the Carolina rig and things like that, but I think we'll finish up on the drop shot, and we can talk about the rest of it like in later videos when we're doing more technique specific videos. But the drop shot is, I'm not going to talk about it like what's been put out 100 times before, where you can pick one little area apart with it, you can fish it up against boat structure, it's brilliant. That is all true, and it's all worked well for me. But the one thing that I found the drop shot to be really good for, it was a few years ago that I started doing it, and that was sight fishing for perch with it. So if you have got clear water venues, using the drop shot can be really effective, because I was targeting these big perch that was just sort of laid up in this one area in particular. You would see them a lot, but because you'd see them a lot, everybody else would see them a lot, and they'd been fished for with everything, live baits, worm, maggot, all different manner of lures, and they were really hard to catch. Using the drop shot, I was having a really big tail between the drop shot weight and the hook. I was casting behind the fish, just inching it up behind it, and I was letting the lure fall freely right next to the head. So the fish is looking outwards, I was getting my lure to sort of drop either this side or that side, and 9 times out of 10 they'd just lift off the bottom, they'd turn, and then they'd just nail it straight away, almost like they was picking up just a free offering of maggot. And it works really, really well. Now, why I think it works better than if you was just casting out a weightless lure and letting it sink freely is because you have got that drop shot weight. It does allow you to be a bit more accurate. So if you are fishing in, like, even I say fairly deep water, like 4 foot plus, sometimes it can be quite hard to judge where your like weightless lure is going to fall, especially if there's a bit of flow, and that can be a bit of a nightmare to get it to fall exactly where you want it. By having that drop shot weight on, even though we're still getting the lure to fall free under its own weight, by having that weight on, we can be a bit more accurate, and we've got like a bit of an anchor point where we can so if we do need to inch that lure forward, because we have got that anchor point, like I say, can be very, very accurate with where it falls, and it worked really well. And if you want any proof of how effective that way of fishing for them is, if you've seen the YPC final with the 4-pounder that we caught, that is exactly how we caught that fish. Those fish were coming in, they were smashing bait fish, so we dropped it, dropped the drop shot in, waited for these fish to come round, and as soon as the big one did, just lowered the rod tip ever so slightly, that lure fell under its own weight, and that fish literally just turned and just hit it again, just like a free offering of, like he was throwing a maggot in or something for it. Very, very effective for sight fishing for perch. So we'll leave that there. Hope some of this makes sense, and it will help you in the long run. Like I say, venue choice is absolutely imperative when you are targeting big fish of any species. You know, don't be wasting your time trying to catch fish of a certain size that are just not there. So I hope that helps, and it'd be great to see if anyone puts any of this into practice and does catch a personal best or a real big, and drop it in the comments. It'd be great to see. Cheers.